The gold band caught the lamplight as Nora Porter's trembling fingers placed it on the counter of Henderson's general store, and she knew that letting go of her mother's ring felt like burying her twice. The shopkeeper barely glanced up from his ledger before offering her $30, a pittance for the only heirloom she possessed. But the undertaker's bill sat heavy in her coat pocket, and grief had stripped away her pride along with everything else. She walked out into the bitter March wind that swept through Veta, Colorado in 1883, with enough money to give her mother a proper burial, and nothing left to remember her by except the hollow ache in her chest. Lucas Zimmerman noticed the woman the moment she stepped out of Henderson's store, because sorrow had a particular way of weighing down a person's shoulders, and he recognized it like an old acquaintance. He had ridden into Veta 3 days prior with a herd of cattle bound for the stockyards, planning to stay just long enough to collect his wages and move on to the next job. But something about the high mountain air and the way the Spanish peaks loomed in the distance made him linger. He stood outside the saloon rolling a cigarette when she passed, her dark hair whipping loose from its pins, her face pale as fresh cream, her eyes red-rimmed and distant. She did not notice him at all. Later that evening, Lucas found himself back at Henderson's, needing tobacco and maybe some decent coffee if the old man had any in stock. Henderson was in a talkative mood, the way shopkeepers often were when business was slow, and he pulled out a small wooden box from beneath the counter with the self-importance of a man displaying treasure. "Got me some fine pieces today," Henderson said, opening the box to reveal a modest collection of jewelry. "That ring there, the gold one with the little garnets, came from the Porter girl. Her mama passed 2 days back from the consumption. Poor thing had nothing else to sell, and the undertaker would not wait." Lucas picked up the ring, turning it in his fingers. It was delicate work, the kind of piece a woman would cherish not for its monetary value but for what it represented. The garnets caught the light like drops of blood, and he could see where years of wear had thinned the band slightly on one side. He thought of the woman with the sorrowful shoulders and made a decision that surprised even himself. "I will take it," he said. Henderson named a price of $45, inflating it because he recognized opportunity when it walked through his door. Lucas paid without haggling, tucked the ring into his vest pocket, and walked out into the cold night wondering what exactly he planned to do with it. Finding Nora Porter proved easier than expected in a town the size of Veta. She was staying in a small room above the post office, working whatever odd jobs she could find to pay her rent. Lucas learned this from the postmaster's wife, who seemed eager to share the tragic story of the young woman who had arrived in town 6 months ago with her ailing mother, hoping the mountain air would cure what city doctors could not fix. The consumption had other plans. Lucas spent the next day working up the courage to approach her, which felt ridiculous for a man who had faced down rustlers and broken wild horses, and once talked his way out of a gunfight with nothing but calm words and steady eyes. But walking up to a grieving woman and returning a ring she had sold out of desperation required a different kind of bravery, one he was not sure he possessed. He finally found her behind the church, kneeling beside a fresh grave marked with a simple wooden cross. The sun was setting behind the Spanish peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for such a sorrowful scene. Lucas removed his hat and waited at a respectful distance until she finally stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Miss Porter." His voice came out rougher than intended. She turned, startled, her hand going to her throat in a defensive gesture. Up close, he could see she was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 22 or 23, with green eyes that held both wariness and exhaustion. "I am sorry to disturb you," he continued quickly. "My name is Lucas Zimmerman. I am a drover, just passing through town, but I heard about your loss and I wanted to offer my condolences." "That is kind of you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone too tired for emotion. "But you did not know my mother." "No, madam, I did not." He shifted his weight, acutely aware of the ring in his pocket. "But I did hear that you had to sell something precious to pay for her burial." Her expression closed off immediately, pride straightening her spine despite her exhaustion. "I do not need charity, Mr. Zimmerman. This is not charity." He pulled the ring from his pocket and held it out to her. "I bought this from Henderson yesterday. I would like you to have it back." Nora stared at the ring as if it were a ghost made solid, her face draining of what little color it had held. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, then stopped midair. "I cannot afford to buy it back. Whatever you paid, I do not have it. I am not asking you to buy it. I am giving it to you." "Why?" The word came out sharp with suspicion. "You do not know me. Why would you do this?" Lucas had asked himself the same question a dozen times since purchasing the ring, and he still did not have a good answer. "My mother died when I was 15, he said finally. "Fever took her in less than a week. My father sold everything she owned to pay the debts, including her wedding ring. I always wished someone had thought to buy it back for me, just so I would have something of hers to hold on to. So I guess I am doing for you what I wished someone had done for me." The explanation hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Nora's eyes filled with tears that she tried desperately to blink away, her jaw clenched tight against the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "You do not have to say anything." He stepped closer and gently took her hand, pressing the ring into her palm and closing her fingers around it. Her hand was small and cold, calloused from recent hard work. "It belongs with you." She looked down at their hands, his rough and sun-browned, hers pale and trembling, both wrapped around the small circle of gold. When she looked back up at him, tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling, a small fragile thing that transformed her features from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than 2 syllables should be able to hold. "Thank you so much." Lucas touched the brim of his hat and turned to leave, feeling both satisfied and strangely reluctant to walk away. He had done what he set out to do. The ring was returned. His conscience was clear. There was no reason to linger. "Mr. Zimmerman." Her voice stopped him after 3 steps. He turned back. "Yes, madam. Would you like to have supper with me?" The invitation came out rushed, as if she spoke before she could talk herself out of it. "It would not be much, just stew and biscuits, but I would like to repay your kindness somehow, and I make decent biscuits." Lucas found himself smiling, a real genuine smile that felt unusual on his face after years of keeping his expressions carefully neutral. "I would like that very much." They walked together back toward town as twilight settled over the valley, and Lucas learned that Nora had grown up in Philadelphia, that her father had died in the war before she was born, that her mother had been a seamstress who taught her daughter everything she knew about needle and thread. Nora learned that Lucas had been working cattle drives since he was 16, that he had no permanent home and preferred it that way, that he could read and write because his mother had insisted on schooling even when his father said it was a waste of time for a boy who would spend his life on horseback. The room above the post office was small but clean, with a narrow bed pushed against one wall, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a cast-iron stove that Nora coaxed to life with practiced efficiency. While she prepared the meal, Lucas sat at the table and watched her move around the cramped space, noting how she had made it as homely as possible with a few wildflowers in a chipped vase and a carefully mended curtain at the single window. The stew was simple but good, heavy on potatoes and light on meat, the kind of meal people ate when money was tight but pride demanded hospitality. The biscuits were, as promised, excellent. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, both too hungry and too aware of the strange intimacy of sharing a meal in such close quarters to talk much. "Where will you go now?" Lucas asked finally, mopping up the last of his stew with a piece of biscuit. "Will you stay in Veta?" Nora looked down at her mother's ring, which she had slipped back onto her finger the moment they entered the room. "I do not know. I came here because Mama needed the mountain air, but now that she is gone, I have no real reason to stay. But I have no reason to leave either, and no money for travel even if I did. So I suppose I will stay until something changes. Can you find work here? Some. Mrs. Henderson needs help with washing and mending. The hotel sometimes needs someone to change linens. It is enough to pay rent and buy food, but not much beyond that." She met his eyes across the small table. "What about you? Where will you go?" "North, probably. There is always work on the ranches up near Denver, and I heard they are hiring for a big cattle drive that will head out to Wyoming come spring." "That sounds like hard work." "It is, but it is honest work and I am good at it." He stood, recognizing that he had stayed as long as propriety allowed. "Thank you for the meal, Miss Porter. It was the best I have had in a long time." She walked him to the door, and in the narrow space at the top of the stairs, they stood close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair. "Thank you again for the ring, Mr. Zimmerman. You cannot know what it means to me." "Lucas," he said. "You can call me Lucas." "Then you should call me Nora." He touched his hat brim and descended the stairs, stepping out into the night with the taste of her biscuits still on his tongue, and the memory of her smile warming something in his chest that had been cold for longer than he cared to admit. Lucas told himself he would leave Veta in the morning. His business was concluded. He had returned the ring. There was no reason to stay. But morning came and found him still in town, inventing excuses. His horse needed new shoes. He should stock up on supplies before heading north. The weather looked uncertain. Better to wait a day or two. Each excuse was flimsier than the last, and he knew it, but he kept making them anyway. He found himself walking past the post office at times when he knew Nora might be coming or going. Sometimes he caught glimpses of her carrying a basket of washing or hurrying toward the hotel with her sewing kit. Once, their eyes met across the street, and she smiled at him, a quick flash of warmth that he carried with him for the rest of the day. On the third day after returning the ring, he encountered her at the general store. She was examining a bolt of fabric with the careful attention of someone who could not afford to make a poor choice, running her fingers over the weave and calculating silently. "Planning a new dress?" he asked, approaching with his hat in hand. She jumped slightly, then relaxed when she saw who it was. "Hoping to. Mrs. Henderson wants some new curtains for the store and she is paying me to make them. I thought if I bought enough fabric, I could make myself a new shirtwaist as well. Mine are getting worn through." Lucas looked at the price marked on the fabric and made another impulsive decision. "Get what you need for the curtains and your shirtwaist. I will cover the difference." "Lucas, no." She shook her head firmly. "You have already done too much." "Then consider it an investment. You cannot make money sewing if you do not have fabric to sew with." They argued quietly in the corner of the store, her insisting she could not accept more charity, him insisting it was not charity but practical business sense. Finally, she agreed to accept it as a loan, which they both knew she would never be in a position to repay. But it let her keep her dignity, and that mattered. Henderson cut the fabric and wrapped it in brown paper, and Lucas paid while Nora pretended to examine a display of canned goods, so she did not have to watch. Outside the store, She clutched the package to her chest and looked up at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You should let me cook for you again," she said. "I cannot repay the money, but I can at least feed you properly while you are in town. You do not have to do that." "I know I do not have to, I want to." She met his eyes directly. "Unless you do not want to." "I want to," he said quickly, more quickly than pride should have allowed. "I would like that very much." So it became a pattern. Lucas would show up at her door in the evenings with some small contribution to the meal, a bit of beef from the butcher or fresh eggs or a jar of preserves. Nora would cook, and they would eat together at her small table, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about life on the cattle trails, about sleeping under stars so thick they looked like spilled salt, about river crossings and stampedes, and the particular satisfaction of delivering a herd intact after months on the trail. She told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about the tiny apartment she had shared with her mother, about learning to make something beautiful out of scraps because they could never afford anything new. Neither of them spoke about the future or acknowledged the fact that Lucas kept finding reasons not to leave town. It existed between them like a third presence at the table, patient and waiting. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after he had returned the ring, Lucas arrived to find Nora's door ajar and the sound of crying coming from within. He knocked softly and pushed the door open to find her sitting on the edge of her bed, shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands. "Nora." He crossed the room in 3 strides, all thoughts of propriety forgotten. "What happened?" She looked up at him with tear-streaked cheeks and tried to compose herself, but her voice broke when she spoke. "Mrs. Henderson does not need my help anymore. Her sister is coming to stay, and she will do the washing and mending. And the hotel found someone else, a woman whose husband just died and who needs the work more than I do." She drew a shuddering breath. "I will not be able to pay rent next week. I am going to lose this room." Lucas sat beside her on the bed, close enough that their shoulders touched, and let her cry. When the storm of tears finally subsided, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it to her. She wiped her face, embarrassed, refusing to meet his eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered. "You should not have to see me like this. You have nothing to apologize for." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Listen to me, Nora. You are not going to lose this room. I have money saved. Let me help. I cannot keep taking from you, Lucas. It is not right." "Then come with me." The words came out before he fully thought them through, but once spoken, he realized he meant them completely. "I am heading north to Denver. Come with me. You can find work there, real work, not just scraps and odd jobs. It is a growing city. A woman with your skills could make a decent living." She stared at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. "I cannot just travel north with you. People would talk. My reputation would be ruined. Then marry me." The silence that followed was absolute. Lucas could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the pulse jumping in Nora's wrist where he still held her hand. He had not planned to propose, had not even consciously admitted to himself that he was falling in love with her, but now that the words were out, they felt inevitable. "Marry you." Nora repeated faintly. "Lucas, we have known each other for 2 weeks. I know, and if you need more time, I will wait. But I also know that I have spent the last 2 weeks finding excuses not to leave this town, because the thought of riding away and never seeing you again makes me feel like I am losing something essential. I know that when I am with you, I feel more at home than I have since my mother died. I know that you are brave and proud and kind, and that you make the best biscuits I have ever tasted." He squeezed her hand gently. "If that is not enough reason to get married, I do not know what is." Nora was crying again, but quietly now, tears sliding down her cheeks as she searched his face for any sign of doubt or deception. You really mean this? Every word. I do not have anything to bring to a marriage, Lucas. No dowry, no property, no family connections. Just debts and a dead mother and this ring. That is more than enough. You are more than enough. She leaned forward and kissed him then, a soft, tentative press of lips that tasted of salt and hope. Lucas cupped her face in his hands and kissed her back, gentle and careful, treating her like something precious that might break. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "Yes," Nora whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Veta. The ceremony took place in the small church where Nora's mother was buried, with the postmaster and his wife serving as witnesses. Nora wore her least worn dress with her mother's ring on her finger, and a crown of early spring wildflowers in her hair that Lucas had picked himself that morning. Lucas wore his cleanest shirt and stood straighter than he ever had in his life, as he promised to love and honor and cherish this woman who had come into his life like unexpected grace. After the ceremony, they had a simple meal at the hotel restaurant, and then Lucas brought his new wife to the boarding house where he had been staying and carried her over the threshold of his rented room as she laughed and protested that he would hurt his back. That night, they consummated their marriage with a combination of tenderness and nervous uncertainty that gradually gave way to genuine passion, as they learned the geography of each other's bodies, and began the long process of truly belonging to one another. In the morning, they packed their few belongings and prepared to head north. The postmaster's wife had tears in her eyes as she hugged Nora goodbye, pressing a package of food into her hands for the journey. Henderson gave Lucas a curt nod that might have contained a hint of respect. And then they were riding out of Veta, Nora seated behind Lucas on his horse with her arms wrapped around his waist and her cheek pressed against his back, heading toward Denver and whatever future they could build together. The journey took 5 days through mountain passes, still choked with late spring snow and valleys just beginning to green with new growth. They traveled slowly, stopping frequently to rest the horse and stretch their legs. At night, they made camp beside streams or in the shelter of pine forests, and Lucas taught Nora how to build a proper fire and make coffee that did not taste like mud. She proved to be a quick learner and a good traveling companion, never complaining about the cold or the hard ground or the simple monotony of beans and bacon. On the third night, as they lay together under a canvas tarp with the stars brilliant overhead, Nora traced the line of Lucas's jaw with her fingertips and said, "Tell me about your mother." So he did, stories he had not shared with anyone in years. He told her about his mother's laugh, how she had sung while she worked, how she had defied his father's wishes to make sure Lucas learned his letters. He told her about the way she had died, quick and brutal, the fever taking her from robust health to the grave in less than a week. And he told her about the guilt he still carried for not being able to save her, for being too young and too helpless to do anything but watch. When he finished, Nora kissed him softly and said, "She would have liked knowing you helped me. She would have been proud of the man you became." Those words settled something in Lucas that had been restless for longer than he realized. He pulled Nora closer, burying his face in her hair, and let himself believe it might be true. They reached Denver on a bright May morning, riding into a city that seemed to be growing before their eyes. New buildings were going up on every block. Businesses were opening. People were flooding in with dreams of silver and gold and fresh starts. The energy was palpable and infectious, and even Lucas, who had always preferred open spaces to crowded streets, felt something like excitement stirring in his chest. He found them lodging at a respectable boarding house, run by a stern widow who looked them over with a critical eye, before agreeing to rent them a room. It was larger than Nora's room in Veta had been, with a real bed and a proper stove and a window that looked out over a busy street. Nora stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking it all in, and Lucas watched her face light up with something that looked like hope. "It is perfect," she said. "It is a starting point," he corrected. "Someday I will get you a real house, with a kitchen and a parlor and a garden if you want one." She crossed to him and wrapped her arms around his neck, standing on her toes to kiss him. "This is enough. You are enough. Everything else is just extra." Lucas found work quickly at the stockyards, using his skills with cattle and horses to earn decent wages. The work was hard and the hours were long, but it paid better than trail driving and let him come home to Nora every night, which he found he valued more than he had expected. Nora took in sewing and mending, building up a small but steady clientele of women who appreciated her fine stitching and fair prices. They fell into a rhythm, a domestic pattern that felt both strange and comforting to Lucas, who had spent most of his adult life drifting from job to job with no ties and no responsibilities beyond himself. Now he had a wife to come home to, a woman who had his dinner waiting and his clothes mended, and who kissed him hello at the end of each day like his presence mattered. It terrified and delighted him in equal measure. Summer settled over Denver with dusty heat and long golden evenings. On Sundays, when neither of them had to work, they would take walks along Cherry Creek or sit in their room with the windows open, reading aloud to each other from whatever books they could borrow. Nora was teaching Lucas to cook beyond basic trail fare, and he was teaching her to appreciate the silences that existed comfortably between two people who did not need to fill every moment with words. One August evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Nora said quietly, "I think I might be with child." Lucas froze, the words taking a moment to fully register. "You think? You are not certain, not completely certain, but fairly sure." "I have missed my courses twice now, and I have been feeling sick in the mornings." She turned to look at him, her expression uncertain. "Are you pleased, pleased?" He pulled her into his lap, cradling her face in his hands. "Nora, I am terrified and thrilled and completely unprepared, but yes, I am pleased, more than pleased. I am happy." She relaxed against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I am scared," she admitted. "My mother almost died having me. And we do not have much money saved, and I do not know how I will keep taking in sewing once the baby comes, and what if something goes wrong?" "Then we will handle it together," Lucas said firmly. "We will figure it out the same way we have figured out everything else. You are not alone in this, Nora. You have me." The pregnancy was confirmed by a doctor in September, and Nora's fear gradually transformed into cautious excitement as her body changed, and the reality of the coming child became undeniable. Lucas found himself working extra hours, taking on additional jobs, desperate to save enough money to see them through the months when Nora would not be able to work. The widow who ran their boarding house proved to be surprisingly kind, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and promising to help when the time came. Winter arrived early and harsh that year, snow falling in thick blankets that muffled the city's constant noise. Nora grew larger and more uncomfortable, her hands and feet swelling, her back aching constantly. Lucas did what he could to help, rubbing her feet in the evenings and bringing her treats from the bakery and trying not to let his worry show when she winced and pressed her hand to her side. The baby came on a bitter February night in 1884, nearly a year after Lucas had first seen Nora walking out of Henderson's store with sorrow weighing down her shoulders. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when Lucas was convinced he was going to lose both of them. He paced the hallway outside their room while the doctor and the boarding house widow worked, flinching at every cry of pain that penetrated the door. Finally, as dawn was breaking gray and cold over Denver, he heard the thin wail of a newborn baby. The door opened, and the widow appeared, smiling despite her exhaustion. "You have a son, Mr. Zimmerman, a healthy, loud son, and your wife is tired but well." Lucas pushed past her into the room, barely hearing her indignant protest. Nora lay propped up in bed, pale and exhausted, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. And in her arms, wrapped in a clean blanket, was the smallest human being Lucas had ever seen. "Come meet your son," Nora said softly, her voice hoarse from screaming. Lucas approached the bed on shaking legs and sat carefully on the edge, staring down at the red-faced infant who was already waving tiny fists in apparent outrage at being expelled from his warm, comfortable home. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a furious expression that reminded Lucas somehow of Nora when she was determined. "He is perfect," Lucas whispered, afraid to speak any louder and disturb this fragile moment. "You are perfect, both of you. Do you want to hold him?" Lucas had held plenty of newborn calves and foals in his time, but a human baby felt entirely different. He took his son carefully, supporting the small head the way the widow had taught him to do with a rag doll in preparation for this moment, and looked down into eyes that seemed to be trying to focus on his face. "Hello there, little man," he said softly. "I am your papa. And I promise you, I am going to do better by you than my father did by me. You are going to know you are loved every single day of your life." They named him James, after Nora's father who had died before she was born, and he proved to be a colicky, demanding baby who slept in short bursts and woke crying for no apparent reason at all hours of the night. Lucas had never been so exhausted in his life, even during the worst cattle drives, but he also had never been so completely happy. There was something profound about walking the floor at 3 in the morning with his son against his shoulder, patting the small back and humming tunelessly until the crying stopped and the tiny body relaxed into sleep. Nora recovered slowly from the birth, and for several weeks Lucas carried the bulk of the baby care in addition to working. The widow helped when she could, and some of Nora's sewing clients sent food and offered assistance, creating a small community of support around them. By the time spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the streets to mud, Nora was back on her feet and James had developed into a slightly less fussy baby who occasionally slept for more than 2 hours at a stretch. Life settled into a new pattern, one that revolved entirely around their son's needs and schedule. Lucas continued to work at the stockyards, gradually moving into a supervisor position that paid better and required less physical labor. Nora took in sewing when she could manage it around caring for James, though she made far less than she had before. Money was tight, but they managed, and Lucas never once regretted the decision to return that ring to a grieving woman in Veta. When James was 6 months old, plump and healthy and beginning to smile at everything that moved, Lucas came home one evening with unexpected news. "I have been offered a job," he said, swinging James up into the air as the baby shrieked with delight. "A good one. Managing a ranch about 30 miles north of here. It comes with a house, Nora. A real house. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a parlor, and land. 5 acres that come with the position, and the owner said if we want to run some cattle of our own on it, that would be fine." Nora looked up from the shirt she was mending, her expression unreadable. "That sounds like the kind of job a man settles into. No more drifting." "No more drifting," Lucas agreed. He sat down beside her, still holding James, and met her eyes directly. I know I always said I preferred moving around, no ties, no permanent place. But that was before I had you, before I had him." He nodded at the baby. "Now all I want is to give you both a stable home and a good life. What do you think?" Nora set down her mending and reached over to take Lucas's hand. Her mother's ring caught the lamplight, the garnets glowing like tiny embers. "I think it sounds perfect," she said. "When do we leave?" They moved to the ranch in late summer, loading their modest possessions into a wagon and making the journey north with James bundled carefully between them. The house was everything Lucas had promised, simple but sturdy, with glass windows and wooden floors and a stove that did not smoke. Nora walked through each room slowly, already planning where furniture would go and how she would make curtains for the windows, her face glowing with an excitement Lucas had not seen since their wedding day. The work was hard but satisfying. Lucas managed a crew of ranch hands, overseeing the cattle operation and making decisions about breeding and selling. In his free time, he started building up their own small herd with the money he managed to save. Nora made their house into a home, sewing curtains and cushions, planting a garden, baking bread in the kitchen that always smelled like yeast and warmth. James grew from a baby into a toddler who learned to walk by pulling himself up on furniture, and took his first steps toward his father's outstretched arms. 2 years after they moved to the ranch, Nora gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Catherine, who had her mother's green eyes and a much calmer temperament than her brother. The birth was easier this time, quicker and less frightening, though Lucas still paced and worried until the doctor emerged to announce that both mother and daughter were healthy. Life on the ranch developed a rhythm that felt eternal, seasons cycling through with predictable reliability. Spring meant calving and branding and long days in the saddle. Summer meant haying and mending fences and watching thunderstorms roll across the plains. Fall meant roundup and shipping cattle to market and preparing for winter. Winter meant huddling close to the stove and telling stories and waiting for spring to come around again. James grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning about horses and cattle and the land. Catherine grew into a sweet-natured girl who preferred staying close to her mother, learning to sew and cook and tend the garden. In 1888, Nora gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas, who proved to be a perfect blend of his siblings' temperaments, neither too wild nor too tame. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Lucas came home from working the far pastures to find Nora sitting on the porch in the golden evening light, her hands still for once, no mending or sewing or children demanding her attention. He sat down beside her and took her hand, running his thumb over her mother's ring. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Marrying me so quickly, coming out here to the middle of nowhere?" Nora leaned her head on his shoulder, sighing contentedly. "Not for a single moment." "Do you regret buying back this ring? Best $45 I ever spent." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Inside the house, they could hear the children playing, James bossing his siblings around while Catherine protested and Thomas laughed. It was the sound of family, of home, of a life built slowly and carefully out of an impulsive act of kindness. "I was thinking," Nora said eventually, "that we should go back to Veta someday. I would like to visit my mother's grave, show her the family I have now, let her know that everything turned out all right." "We will go," Lucas promised. "Maybe this fall after Roundup. We can make a trip of it, show the children where we met." That fall, they did exactly that, loading the children into a wagon and making the journey south to Veta. The town had not changed much in 5 years, though Henderson's general store had a fresh coat of paint, and there was a new hotel going up on the main street. They visited Nora's mother's grave, which Nora had carefully tended over the years through arrangements with the church. And Lucas watched as his wife knelt in the grass and told her mother about her grandchildren, about her life on the ranch, about how happy she was. The children grew restless quickly, so Lucas took them for a walk around town while Nora spent time at the grave. They ended up at the small church where he and Nora had been married, and Lucas stood in the doorway remembering that day, how nervous he had been, how beautiful Nora had looked with wildflowers in her hair, how right it had felt to promise his life to hers. "Papa, why are you smiling?" James asked, tugging on his hand. "Just remembering the day I married your mother," Lucas said. "Best decision I ever made. Even better than getting horses." James was at an age where horses were the most important thing in the universe. Even better than horses. That night, they stayed at the hotel, and after the children were finally asleep in the adjoining room, Lucas and Nora lay together in the darkness talking quietly about the past and the future. "Do you think we will have more children?" Nora asked, her hand resting on his chest over his heart. "Do you want more? Maybe 1 or 2 more. I like our family. I like the noise and the chaos and the feeling of always having someone who needs me." "Then we will have more," Lucas agreed, kissing her forehead. "As many as you want." They returned to the ranch as October was painting the aspens gold and the nights were turning crisp. Life resumed its familiar pattern, but something had shifted, some final piece falling into place. Nora threw herself into preparing for winter with renewed energy, putting up preserves and sewing warm clothes for the children. Lucas worked alongside his ranch hands with a deep contentment, knowing that when the day's work was done, he would return to a warm house full of people who loved him. In the spring of 1889, Nora announced she was pregnant again, and in January of 1890, she gave birth to twin girls they named Elizabeth and Mary. The births were difficult, the babies small and fragile, and for several terrifying weeks Lucas was not sure they would survive. But both girls proved to be fighters, gradually growing stronger and healthier, and by the time spring arrived they were thriving. With 5 children, the house suddenly felt much smaller. Lucas began building an addition, working on it in his spare time with help from some of the ranch hands. He added 2 more bedrooms and expanded the kitchen, giving Nora more space to work and the children more room to play. By the time the twins were walking, the additions were complete, and the house felt like it had always been that size. The years flowed past with the inexorable quality of a river moving toward the sea. James grew into a teenager who could ride better than most of the ranch hands and who had his father's way with horses. Catherine became a skilled seamstress like her mother and grandmother before her, already talking about opening her own shop someday. Thomas developed a surprising talent for numbers and announced he wanted to be a banker, which made both his parents laugh even as they encouraged the dream. The twins were still young, but showed signs of being absolutely fearless, climbing everything they could reach and leading their older siblings on wild adventures. In 1895, 12 years after Lucas had first walked into Henderson's general store and bought a ring for a woman he barely knew, he and Nora celebrated their anniversary by taking a rare night away from the ranch and the children. They rode up into the mountains to a favorite spot overlooking the valley, bringing blankets and food and a bottle of wine that Lucas had been saving for a special occasion. They sat on a flat rock as the sun set, wrapped in blankets against the mountain chill, and watched their ranch spread out below them, the house tiny in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney where the children were no doubt running their housekeeper ragged. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is our life," Nora said softly. When I was selling that ring, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything that mattered. I never imagined that letting it go would lead to all of this." "I think your mother would be proud," Lucas said. "Of the woman you became, of the family you built." "I think she would have loved you," Nora replied. "She always said that the measure of a good man was not in grand gestures but in daily kindness, in showing up and doing what needed to be done, even when it was hard." She turned to look at him, her face soft in the dying light. "You have been that man every single day since I met you." Lucas kissed her then, a long, slow kiss that tasted of wine and possibility and 12 years of accumulated love. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "I would do it all again," Lucas said. "Every moment, every decision, every hardship. If it meant ending up here with you, I would do it all exactly the same." "Even the twins' colic," Nora teased. "Those first 6 months were brutal. Even that." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Though maybe next time we could aim for just one baby at a time." "Next time?" Nora raised an eyebrow. "Lucas Zimmerman, I am 34 years old with 5 children. I think my baby-making days are probably behind me." "Probably," he agreed, "but not certainly." They stayed on the mountain until the stars came out, brilliant and countless overhead, the same stars that had watched over them during their journey from Veta to Denver all those years ago. The same stars that would watch over their children and grandchildren in years to come, constant and enduring. When they finally rode back down to the ranch, they found the house in cheerful chaos. The housekeeper had given up trying to maintain order and was instead sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea while the children ran wild. James was teaching the twins to ride broomsticks like horses. Catherine was sewing doll clothes by lamplight. Thomas had spread his school books across every available surface. Lucas and Nora stood in the doorway taking it all in, and Lucas felt the same profound sense of rightness that he had felt the first time he held baby James. This was his life. This noise, this chaos, this overwhelming abundance of love and family. It had all started with an impulsive act of kindness toward a grieving stranger, and it had grown into something more beautiful and enduring than he could have ever imagined. The years continued their steady march. The children grew and changed, developing into their own people with their own dreams and personalities. James eventually married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property and took over managing the day-to-day operations of the ranch, letting Lucas slowly step back into a supervisory role. Catherine did indeed open her own dressmaking shop in Denver, marrying a lawyer and building a successful business. Thomas went east to study banking and returned with a degree and a pretty wife from Boston. The twins remained close as they grew, both eventually marrying brothers from a family in town and settling nearby. Lucas and Nora became grandparents, and then great-grandparents, watching their family tree branch and spread in directions they could never have anticipated. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down but their love for each other never diminishing. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming something worn and comfortable and absolutely essential. On a warm September evening in 1920, 37 years after they first met, Lucas and Nora sat together on the porch of the house they had built and filled with life. Nora's hands were gnarled with arthritis now, but she still wore her mother's ring, the gold thin with wear, the garnet still catching the light. Lucas's back was bent from years of hard work, but his eyes were still clear and sharp. "Do you remember the first meal I cooked for you?" Nora asked, her voice still strong despite her age. "Stew and biscuits, best biscuits I ever tasted. You say that every time I make them, because it is true every time." Lucas took her hand carefully, mindful of her painful joints. Thank you, Nora, for saying yes. For taking a chance on a drifter with nothing to offer but a returned ring and a promise to figure things out together. Thank you for buying that ring, she replied. Thank you for seeing me when I was at my lowest and choosing kindness. Thank you for building this life with me. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, surrounded by the sounds of their grandchildren playing in the yard, their children's voices drifting out from inside the house. It was a good life, built slowly and carefully from an impulsive act of compassion, and neither of them would have changed a single moment of it. As darkness settled over the ranch and the first stars began to appear, Lucas tightened his grip on Nora's hand and thought about the young man he had been, standing in Henderson's general store with a ring in his pocket and no clear plan for what came next. He had followed his instinct toward kindness, and it had led him home in every sense of the word. He had learned that sometimes the most profound acts were the simplest ones, that returning a sold ring could change everything, that love could grow from compassion and flourish into something enduring and true. And he was grateful, every single day, that he had been brave enough to walk into a stranger's grief and offer what comfort he could, because that single decision had given him everything that mattered, a lifetime of love and family, and belonging that started with a gold ring with garnet stones, and a woman brave enough to accept kindness from a stranger.